our final presentation of today is from Paul Davidson, who is the Chief Exec of iStandUK and the CIO of Sedgemoor Council. He's talking about a MHCLG funded project which looks at data standards for vulnerable people. So maybe something a wee bit different to some of the other presentations that we've heard from.
Good morning, my name's Phil Swan. I'm the Director for Digital at Greater Manchester Combined Authority. I'm here with Paul Davidson today to talk about the SAVVI Project, the Scalable Approach to Vulnerability via Interoperability. Paul's going to talk a bit more about the project and its specifics. I'm going to do a bit of an intro and really reflect on why this project's important for Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And I think the starting point for that is probably been the last 8 months or so through the pandemic. Maybe COVID has highlighted, I think we'd all agree, highlighted for all of us some huge inequalities in our society, probably more than ever. And we've needed to mobilise in new ways to new audiences rapidly in more joined up ways, and some of that's worked well, some of it perhaps not as well as perhaps would have liked. It certainly led us, certainly from my perspective, has led us to reflect on our priorities and our agreed values in that context. And one aspect that has really been very clear is that different aspects of our different communities and individuals, even households across our city region, have experienced COVID very differently, as they have everywhere in the whole country. And whilst one of our strengths in Greater Manchester has been our whole system approach and how we've mobilised around that, it's still hard, it's still difficult, very difficult to join up support around individuals, to know which specific individuals, which households, and they may not be in households, as part of the focus of the work here for us is around homelessness and homeless people. How we work better to deliver quickly, rapidly, more effectively, humanely, reflecting changing needs in joined up ways. And this is something of a holy grail, I know, for many of us in public services, but right now it's more pertinent and relevant than ever. So having a system-wide approach to assessing and evidencing inequalities is a real priority for Greater Manchester, and actually we've defined it as such in our COVID Recovery and Resilience Plan, and that links strongly to the outcomes of this work from my perspective. So to strengthen our approach to this challenge, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, working with iNetwork, and I'm fortunate enough to chair iStandUK, which is a great privilege, working with Paul, working with colleagues from right across the country. We've been looking at this particular challenge. How do we work more effectively and have a more standards-based, scalable model to addressing inequalities, to supporting vulnerable people by being able to join up and use data more effectively, appropriately and responsibly for the needs of our residents. And to explain a bit more about how we're doing that through this work, I'm going to hand over to Paul Davidson. Many thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Paul Davidson. I'm the Chief Digital Officer of Sedgemoor District Council. That's one of the 4 districts in Somerset. I'm going to give you an update on the SAVVI Project, which is one of the projects that's funded in MHCLG's COVID-19 Challenge Programme. SAVVI stands for Scalable Approach to Vulnerability via Interoperability. So it's about the data standards and data sharing to address a vulnerability. So COVID-19 in particular, but you'll see that we want our outputs to be relevant to many types of vulnerability. We want the name SAVVI to also mean that we're taking good decisions based on ready access to good information. SAVVI is an iStandUK project, so I should first explain that. iStandUK is a part of the iNetwork family. It's hosted by Tameside and we report to the iNetwork board. Our mission is to promote standards for efficiency, transformation and transparency of local services. So the SAVVI scope is right at the core of what we're about. Everyone that represents iStandUK is a serving employee in the public sector. So I'm the Director of Standards Phil Swan from GMCA is our chair, and Shelley from Tameside is the programme manager. So this all started at an iStandUK steering group meeting just as we were starting to recover from the first lockdown. The councillors at the meeting were reflecting on their experiences. The mood was that although councils had been able to find vulnerable people and households and then organise assistance across community groups, it had taken too long and maybe that had led to unnecessary hardship. We felt that iStandUK needed to take the initiative in proposing how data sharing, standards and information governance needed to be improved. We spoke with some councils to capture their experiences. Here you are seeing what Somerset said. These are their words. I've highlighted some of the key points. They're talking about difficulties in data matching, data quality, incompatibilities in structure and terminologies, no common identifiers, geographies that don't line up, and trying to work with free text. And then you'll see comments like at the bottom, how hard it was to match up children to shielded households. And here is what we heard from North Yorkshire County Council, a similar story. They talk about how it was hard to find out which organisation had what data, the many data structures for the same thing, a lack of consistent personal identifiers, and so on. But we didn't want to confine ourselves to just improving how data is used for COVID-19. Finding vulnerable people and households and giving assistance and interventions is a core idea for local government, and standards are more powerful when they apply to many settings, inspire new ways of working, and help many types of organisation to collaborate. We have chosen to focus on homelessness prevention as another vulnerability to ensure that our standards work has wide application. We could have picked poverty or loneliness or school exclusions, but homelessness seemed to be high on everyone's agenda, and there's plenty of work going on to engage with. So you can see we also spoke with Crisis to get their take on how data sharing and multi-agency working could be improved. And we spoke with Bristol City Council to learn from their experiences as a homelessness trailblazer. So here is the scope of the problem that SAVVI set out to solve. Finding vulnerable people and households at risk by combining data from many systems and organisations, assessing their needs and coordinating a multi-agency package of assistance. We'll need to share data, particularly secondary use data, propose some standard structures and information governance steps for that, improve data matching, and then propose how plans and actions can be updated and shared across many organisations in real time. And that was the basis of our bid to the MHCLG COVID Challenge programme, which I'm pleased to say was accepted. Well, nearly. MHCLG had well over 100 bids to the programme, so they looked to see if they could combine bids with a common theme. So we were paired up with a bid from Huntingdonshire District Council and their partners. So that project is about vulnerability, but it needs the data and standards that we'll be exploring. I'll explain more about how SAVVI feeds into that project in a moment. Here are the partners to the project on the left. These are mostly the councils that are on the iStandUK board. Tech UK are there too, as they are also on our board, and you'll see later that listening to suppliers and asking them to test our standards makes them an important partner. So thanks to our partners, they've all participated in all the workshops so far. Similarly, on the right are the national departments and agencies that we've been working with. Each of these have enthusiastically participated, both in workshops and in one-to-one sessions that we've had. SAVVI is only going to make progress if we get participation and buy-in, so we're very pleased. We're going at quite a pace, so we tend to put workshops and events on at short notice. So far, everyone has made time for us. A word about the Huntingdonshire project. They've been applying a risk scoring approach for a couple of years now to find vulnerable people and households. And their project is to generate more evidence that their scoring approach is effective and then promote the approach to other councils. Their approach is based on understanding how key life events such as job loss, family breakdown, bereavement and so on can lead to vulnerability. Perhaps not individually, but when these things happen over, say, an 18-month period, the impact can be cumulative. They've started with some published work on life stress events, and they're doing journey mapping with real clients to test the model and add more. So they're an example of a council who has a risk approach but does not have ready access to all the data. That's where we're joining up to make sense of the underlying data. Well, here's what our PID says we're doing. We're looking for existing standards, and there are plenty of those, particularly across health. We're proposing how those standards can be used or need to be added to share data about events or circumstances or about a risk type. We're process mapping the steps, particularly where data needs to be shared or new data is created, and we're picking out some key data flows to illustrate that, say using data from DWP or from internal council systems. Having found people and households at risk, we're then looking at the standards and protocols that allow plans and actions to be shared across many agencies in real time. At the heart of all this is getting the information governance right. From recent workshops we've had on IG for vulnerability, that seems to be where there's most frustration, and there's an opportunity for SAVVI to make a real difference. Finally, there's only so much we can do in the time and the funding that we have, but our partners are coming up with some big ideas that we'll want to champion as we exit this phase. So we're also building a systemic challenges report to make recommendations back to government. The Lords Public Services Committee made recommendations this week about how the public sector coped with the COVID outbreak, and they include much improved data sharing. Our report will put some practical next steps forward for that. One of the first things that we did was to appoint some technical and standards expertise. We used the digital marketplace to run a competition. That was a good experience for us. We had some good tenders, each with a credible track record, and we got it done in a reasonable timescale. Thanks to Star Procurement too for supporting us through that. So we've appointed Bodvok Limited, and they're taking what we learn in our discovery sessions and turning them into standards and proposals. It's going to look a bit like a BSI PAS document, if you've seen those before, to tell the stories and use cases and then illustrate how the standards fit. I mentioned Tech UK before. During the early phase of the outbreak, a number of suppliers helped local authorities with data analysis or helped to stand up shared portals and so on. So they have a wealth of knowledge, ideas and experience. They'll also tell us if the standards that we propose would be adopted and start to form an ecosystem for vulnerability. And that's the interoperability that we're looking for. So we're mapping out the processes and modelling data to find people and households at risk, assess their needs, provide assistance and interventions, and report into an outcomes framework. I'll run through what we've learned so far. We've run some workshops, again thanks to those that have taken part. We will be publishing the key learning from each workshop on our blog at the iStandUK site. We've brought groups together for COVID-19 and then homelessness and run through the scope on the previous slide. We had a special workshop just on information governance for vulnerability. We had great participation in that, including ICO, Cabinet Office, LGA, NHS England, as well as IG leads from our partner councils. We've also had smaller sessions looking at some of the technical challenges, such as the use of UPRN and using the NHS digital portal to host and socialise the SAVVI standards, processes and terminologies. So in the next few slides, I'll pick out some of what we heard. For COVID-19, these are the sorts of things that councils used to find vulnerable people and households. We're calling these vulnerability attributes in that they are indicators of a potential vulnerability. This information is in many different systems and often controlled by many different organisations. So a lead organisation has got to coordinate the collation of this data, match it up, and then put it through some risk stratification process to generate a prioritisation. Some councils were quite sophisticated about that and had a different contact strategy for risk groups, whereas others just had a single level of risk. So here is where the problems start. Find out who has the data and convince them to share it. During COVID, everyone shared, we didn't hear examples where data wasn't shared, but for other vulnerabilities, some data was not shared, either due to IG concerns or technical difficulties or competing priorities. Having got this data, the lead organisation had to match it up, both on residence and person. Some data didn't use the unique property reference, the UPRN, and matching to names was even harder. It was also hard to match to the National Shielded list for the same reasons, although that has now improved. And here is some of what we heard in the homelessness prevention workshop. Again, it's a list of vulnerability attributes, and again it comes from various systems and organisations. This list is from Bristol City Council. Our partners at Huntingdonshire also had a good list of the life events that their research shows are indicators of potential homelessness. Same problems and even more frustrations. Here is Ollie at Bristol being frustrated as he leads the council's data analysis for homelessness prevention. He has put time and energy into just getting to some data in his own organisation and not always succeeding. It remains with each individual council to satisfy itself that it is acting legally, so it has to act on its own legal opinion. But Ollie would like some guidance and models, and he'd like to be able to point to where data is being shared for the same purpose. And here is what we heard from Huntingdonshire. They talk about a snowball effect. Their research so far has highlighted these events, which if they occur over, say, an 18-month period, can lead to crisis. They'd like to be able to track this type of activity and reach out when a certain score is reached. So we've taken what we learned and created some concept models. Our Bodrock colleagues have pushed this on much further into actual message formats and values, but this is enough to get the idea. It's about extracting data from source systems into a consistent pattern that associates a person in a household with one or more of these attributes and giving some provenance information about where the data came from. And this one is about combining that data, generating a risk category, and sharing plans, actions and events in real time across partner agencies with the trust framework. So this is leading to some data structures, and that's what we'll be testing with our partners. But data structures and common language won't solve all the problems. I mentioned the IG workshop that we held recently, and just by the number of people who wanted to take part, we learned that this is a topic that people are most eager to address. It's becoming clearer about how SAVVI can be the focus for IG for vulnerability, so I'll take you through some of what we established. Firstly, we just clarified the landscape and understood a scope for information governance. These become some of the outputs that we can join up with a common language for vulnerability and share good practice. There are some good tools around that IG people can use to generate some of these outputs. Our workshop saw examples of tools for information sharing agreements, data protection impact assessments, register of processing activities. There seems to be enthusiasm to join these tools up with a common language and read across for specific vulnerability scenarios. We're mapping out what activity leads to what output at each part of the SAVVI process. The secondary use of data is particularly tricky, but this feels like an area that the local public sector needs to address as a community. So our workshop looked at these three distinct parts of the process and understood the steps and IG outputs for each. And from that, the workshop looked at what an IG framework for vulnerability might achieve. How would it unblock some of the problems? Firstly, we can set out some of the terminology. The workshop often returned to the need to unambiguously define each particular vulnerability and relate that to a purpose for data sharing. Many of these are well defined in legislation, and the LGA's powers and duties list gives us a good start. That can lead to a shareable library to browse through, such as related legal gateways, common data sources and so on, that organisations have used. We can then do a deeper dive into the data sets that have been made available and used. That library can then be the language by which organisations can be invited to share the IG outputs for others to build on. So that would be a start, a way for the community to collaborate and share. However, the workshop recognised that in itself that won't accelerate data sharing for vulnerability, and we need some bigger ideas. The Cabinet Office are particularly promoting the Digital Economy Act as a way to share data. It has provisions for sharing for multiple disadvantaged people, and that helps sharing for troubled families. We need a similar vehicle to identify vulnerability, which would need to be put through Parliament. So we're putting a SAVVI group together with the Cabinet Office and the ICO reps on the workshop to scope that out. Well, I look at our Trello board and see what's coming up over the next 2 weeks. We're arranging that workshop with Tech UK. It's an opportunity to hear how suppliers are assisting local authorities to find and support vulnerable people, and for us to show the SAVVI standards so far and get reaction about how deployable they are into suppliers' products. We're picking out some of the key data flows and the IG around them for both COVID-19 and homelessness prevention. It's back to those lists of attributes and who has them. BODVOC are working on the technical end, process mapping and defining the data standards. And we're following up on lots of actions from the IG workshop. Some councils have got a framework or a strategy, and we're keen to find the good practice that's being highlighted. Well, this isn't just going to be an academic report proposing what the standards might be. We plan to trial the standards, particularly with Huntingdonshire. There's data that they need for their risk index, and like many, they have an app that tracks the actions that are taken to give assistance to those that need it. Phil Swan at Greater Manchester Combined Authority is keen to trial the data models that we establish in their predictive analytics work. And as I mentioned, we want to get a reaction and refinements from suppliers to hear if they think that these standards would make their products and services more attractive. And finally, what are we going to recommend as bigger ideas for government? Can we join up with other groups? Can we release more funding? Can we accelerate change? Can we change behaviours? Can we reduce hardship? This list will grow. Perhaps you have ideas too. I've mentioned the scaling up of IG for vulnerability. We also feel that more can be done to improve the use of UPRNs so that they appear in more data sets. Can we also start building that ecosystem driven by standards? Can we fix the plumbing? For example, another project in the MHCLG local digital program is Open Community. That's looking to collate information on local and hyperlocal services in communities and make that available as an API so that app developers can create services that match a person's needs to services in their area. Well, that seems perfect for the referrals and action tracking part of the SAVVI story, so we'd like to look at that and make sure that the standards join up. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. It's a privilege to be able to work on this project and work with the experts and passionate people who are helping us to make a difference. We share and blog at the iStandUK site, and you can contact me at my Sedgemoor address. Please put SAVVI in the title, or I might think that you're trying to sell me something. Thanks for watching.
Thanks very much for that. I'm just actually going to invite Paul up onto the stage to answer some of the questions that are appearing in the chat. So quite a different project to some of the stuff, some of the other case studies that we've seen. And I know that data standards and sharing of data can be a real challenge for organisations, and quite often I've seen it inhibit projects and been used as a reason not to change and not embrace the more innovative options. So I just really wanted to, Paul, can you turn your camera and mic on?
Me now?
There you are. Yep. Good to virtually meet you.
That's right. I have to unplug something and plug it back in, and then it all works again, isn't that? Isn't that the way?
So just a few questions that have come up from the chat. So I was just saying there around some of the sort of GDPR issues, and I know that you were commenting on the chat, and quite often it can be a barrier to transformational projects. And I just wondered if you could talk a wee bit around how you've been able to bring your information governance colleagues with you, and how you've been able to meet the requirements of GDPR, but still looking at some quite sort of challenging issues, and probably some of the most sort of personal and sensitive data that you can get.
Well, certainly. I mean, obviously, this is about highly sensitive data, and it's also about the reuse of this kind of secondary use of data, because much of the data that we're talking about here in building the initial risk index that councils need to do is about pulling data from all sorts of sources for the primary use of systems, be that the housing systems or the council tax or your housing benefits or your electoral roll, all those kind of things, putting them into a single place, and then running some kind of algorithm over it to work out who is most at risk of a particular thing. And that is absolutely, that is GDPR in a nutshell as to whether, doing that correctly. So we have run workshops and in fact filled the virtual room. It's amazing. You put on a workshop for information governance, and I had some great attendance for that. Loads of councils taking part, and as I said, the Information Commissioner's Office and the Digital Economy Act people in Government Digital Service. So this is one of the key frustrations. People aren't confident. They don't know what they can use for what, how to minimize the data, how to join it up. So for some bits of data, there are clear legal gateways that you can use. There are privacy notices that councils stood up that said how they intend to use certain things. In an emergency, typically things like the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, I think it is, suddenly says, you are a Category 1 responder, you have a duty to share data to protect. So, those doors open. There's also been some recent kind of emergency legislation around COVID-19, and that will fall away again, as quickly as that's come, that'll go. So it's about being on top of that. And I think what we've simply found is that we need to help and support local authorities and their partners in a bit of a framework for IG for vulnerability. That's what we're calling it, to make sure councils know which steps they need to go through in what order to make sure they're being compliant and acting legally, but also to be able to share and build a bit of a community of IG specialists around this to say, oh, you're using that data for that purpose, are you? And you've established that with that. Okay, that's some legal opinion that I can share back at base. So that's what we're building. GDPR is at the heart of this, and whatever we come up with will be absolutely compliant.
So we've got another question regarding the semantic web concept that Tim Berners-Lee talks about. So this is from Peter. He's asking, does this project build towards quality linked data?
Well, that kind of 5-star linked data approach is normally talked of in the open data world. So much of that. So if you were providing statistics or terminologies, that's a great way of doing it. It's also good for linking data together, as the questioner asks, around things like location data or geographies or timelines. But one of the things we are very keen to do is to build a bit of an ecosystem out of this, so that because what we saw was many councils quickly stood up, say, a portal, and said, come to our portal and let's start collaborating, and that worked. But it is about joining in on the basis of product, and we want SAVVI to be about joining in on the basis of standards and interoperability. So what we will be coming forward with is a series of APIs, probably RESTful APIs, as the means of joining that club. And if you've got a product that can meet that API, you can join the club, is going to be our approach. So it'll be a bit of a mixture of persistent identifiers and URIs, which is what the question is getting at. And then a more private, secure approach using APIs.
So, I mean, some of the projects that I've worked on, it's always hard when you've got several organisations trying to work together and come to agreement and consensus, and sometimes that can take longer than you would like. And similarly, information governance can be quite a complex issue. I'm just wondering what some of the biggest challenges were in the project, given the complexity of what you're trying to do and the number of organisations that you were working with.
Well, we haven't finished the project yet, fortunately, so we've got till January to deliver what we're calling our playbook. So there'll be a SAVVI playbook, and that playbook will walk through a generic set of steps that we think work for vulnerability in general, and we'll be illustrating it against the COVID-19 experience and then the homelessness experience. And what we're saying is, although the attributes are different and the partners are different and the clients are different, the process is the same. So what SAVVI will be coming forward with is a consistency of process of finding vulnerable people, assessing their needs, reaching out to them, and then referring into the community to get the right help to solve those needs, and then some kind of dashboard at the end to know how you're doing. So the way we've tried to avoid challenges is to not get too drawn into any one particular type of vulnerability. If you get drawn into homelessness, there's a bottomless pit of expertise around homelessness, but it doesn't help you, in trying to deal with a different thing. So if we're dealing with poverty or school exclusions or the risk of potential homelessness, we're trying to say that's all the same pattern. Let's come up with some general standards and ways of working that then enable us to work closer together. And we have found just enthusiasm for that, because people are finding it so frustrating and they feel isolated at the moment. They don't know who to turn to, who to talk to just try and get some basic advice about how to go about tackling vulnerability in general. I think one of the other things I want to highlight is that we've got our workshop with Tech UK on Wednesday. When's that? Okay, Thursday then, and that is about engaging with the supplier side, because it's really important to us that our standards are welcomed and enthusiastically adopted by suppliers of software products to local authorities, and we'll start to see then how much of a challenge that is.
All right, that's great. Thanks very much for participating, and that's all the questions from the chat. So really just bringing today to a close, I think that we've heard some really engaging speakers from across the public sector talking around some of the challenges and how to deliver successful technology projects, and some of that will lead on to the discussion that we'll have tomorrow regarding strategy and how you set yourself up for success.